The bank transfers began on an ordinary Monday in October, small amounts scattered across corporate accounts in Zurich, Singapore and Dubai. Nothing that would catch the attention of financial monitoring algorithms. $100,000 here, $50,000 there. Apparently legitimate commercial transactions between import and export companies. What no surveillance system detected was that these operations were part of one of the most sophisticated financial warfare campaigns ever documented. For 18 months, agents of the Israeli intelligence service had completely infiltrated the financing networks of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, systematically diverting funds intended for the arming and training of militants. The operation, internally known by the codename Golden Mercury, represented a fundamental evolution in counter-terrorism strategy. Instead of simply eliminating physical targets, Mossad had learned to drain the resources that sustained the entire operational infrastructure of adversary groups. The genius of the operation lay in its absolute invisibility. While bombings and targeted assassinations generated headlines and diplomatic protests, the financial manipulation took place in the shadows of global markets. Mahmoud al-Khaled, the man who had meticulously built Islamic Jihad's financing networks over 2 decades, discovered the bleeding only when it was already too late to recover the diverted resources. For months, he had approved transfers he believed were directing funds to operational cells in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. In reality, every transaction was being intercepted and redirected through a chain of shell companies controlled by Israeli agents. The discovery came via a desperate call from a field commander in Jenin, reporting that the resources promised for the acquisition of weapons had never arrived. When Mahmoud initiated an emergency audit of the accounts, he found a labyrinth of falsified documentation and non-existent companies. The scheme had been built with the patience of an architect and the precision of a watchmaker. Mossad agents, operating under elaborate corporate identities, had infiltrated the financial circles that served as a bridge between donors in the Persian Gulf and Palestinian militant groups. They created front companies in jurisdictions known for banking discretion, established relationships with key intermediaries, and gradually assumed control of critical transfer channels. The operation started small, testing vulnerabilities and mapping financial flows. Israeli agents presented themselves as legitimate trade facilitators, offering international transfer services with competitive rates and guarantees of anonymity. Mahmoud, always cautious, initially resisted the approaches, but the reputation of the shell companies had been carefully built through years of successful smaller transactions. When he finally decided to trust the new channels, he was handing over control of the entire financial system he had taken decades to establish. The methodology employed by the Israeli operatives demonstrated a deep understanding of both the psychology and the logistics of terrorist financing. They knew Mahmoud valued discretion above all else, that he preferred channels operating below the radar of international authorities. They exploited this preference by creating an infrastructure that seemed perfect for his needs. The shell companies possessed fabricated trading histories, references from other fictitious clients, and impeccable legal documentation. Every detail had been constructed to withstand the scrutiny of a man known for his paranoia and meticulousness. The agents managing these operations were veterans with decades of experience in covert operations. They spoke fluent Arabic, understood the cultural nuances of business in the Middle East, and had studied Mahmoud's behavioral patterns for years before making the first contact. When they finally approached him, they offered exactly what he was looking for: efficiency, security, and invisibility. During the first 6 months of the operation, Israeli agents diverted approximately $15 million. Amounts small enough not to arouse immediate suspicion, but large enough to significantly impact Islamic Jihad's operations. The money was redirected through a complex chain of bank accounts and investments, making it impossible to trace its final destination. Part of the resources was converted into intelligence, funding information-gathering operations that revealed the location of secret arsenals and plans for future attacks. Another portion was used to bribe key officials within Islamic Jihad's own networks, creating a web of informants that would provide valuable data for years. The rest simply vanished into the international financial labyrinth, contributing to the black budget of Mossad operations. The beauty of the scheme lay in its sustainability. While assassinations created martyrs and bombings generated international sympathy, financial diversion remained invisible to public opinion and devastating to the operational capacity of the target groups. Mahmoud realized something was wrong only when field commanders began reporting systematic delays in weapons deliveries. Initially, he attributed the problems to the usual difficulties of international smuggling. Arms suppliers operated in a world of uncertainty, where delays and logistical complications were a normal part of business. But when delays turned into complete cancellations and suppliers began demanding duplicate payments for goods they claimed never to have received, Mahmoud launched an investigation. What he discovered terrified him more than any death threat he had ever faced. For months, he had been systematically deceived by an intelligence operation so sophisticated it seemed straight out of a spy movie. Every document he examined revealed another layer of deception. Companies he believed he had known for years were fronts created specifically to fool him. Men he had done business with personally were trained agents, playing elaborate roles to gain his trust. The discovery of the infiltration came through an unexpected source. A Swiss accountant, working for one of the shell companies used in the operation, had noticed irregularities in the financial flows. Worried about legal implications for his own career, he made discreet contact with Mahmoud through channels known only to the two of them. During a tense meeting in a Geneva cafe, the accountant revealed that the accounts Mahmoud believed he controlled were being systematically drained by automatic transfers programmed to activate after each deposit. The money remained in the accounts only long enough to generate receipt confirmations before being redirected to unauthorized recipients. Mahmoud listened in silence as the accountant explained how he had discovered the scheme by accident during a routine audit that revealed discrepancies between internal records and official bank statements. At that moment, sitting in an ordinary European cafe, Mahmoud understood that he had lost not only $150 million, but also his reputation as the guardian of the Palestinian resistance's resources. Mahmoud's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a cold analysis of the implications. For 2 decades, he had built his reputation on absolute competence and impenetrable security. Now he discovered he had been systematically deceived for 18 consecutive months. The psychological impact was devastating, but the operational consequences were even worse. Without the diverted funds, operations planned for months would have to be cancelled. Cells that depended on regular funding would be left exposed and vulnerable. The arsenal of weapons Islamic Jihad had planned to acquire would remain in the hands of traffickers, while rival groups would seize the opportunity to expand their own power. Mahmoud faced the possibility of watching the organization he had served for decades disintegrate for lack of resources. Worse still, he knew other militant groups were watching his situation closely. If Islamic Jihad demonstrated financial vulnerability, it would lose not only resources, but also the respect and support of regional sponsors who expected organizational competence in exchange for their investments. The internal investigation Mahmoud conducted revealed the full extent of the Israeli infiltration. Recovered documents showed that Mossad had completely mapped his financial network, identifying every intermediary, every bank account, and every transfer channel. The Israeli agents knew his operational methods better than some of his own subordinates. They had studied his behavioral patterns, his personal preferences, and his psychological vulnerabilities with scientific precision. The operation had not been improvised, but meticulously planned for years. Every approach, every service offer, and every security guarantee had been calculated to exploit specific aspects of Mahmoud's personality and methodology. The Israelis had turned his own security precautions into traps. His preference for discreet channels and trusted intermediaries had become the vehicle of his own destruction. The paranoia that had protected him for decades had been used against him by adversaries who understood his weaknesses better than he did himself. The diverted money represented much more than simple financial resources. Every dollar had been obtained through carefully cultivated networks of sympathizers and donors, many of whom had sacrificed significantly to support the Palestinian cause. Merchants in the Persian Gulf had contributed profits from legitimate businesses. Palestinian families in the diaspora sent monthly remittances. Charitable organizations channeled funds through complex transfer systems. The loss of these resources was not just an operational setback, but a betrayal of the trust of thousands of people who had relied on Mahmoud to use their resources effectively. He knew that news of the diversion, when it inevitably spread, would destroy relationships built over decades. Donors would question the competence and security of the entire organization. Competitors would use the failure to undermine his authority and recruit his own supporters. The Israeli operation had achieved something that bombings and assassinations never achieved, destroying Islamic Jihad internally, using its own forces against itself. In the months following the discovery of the diversion, Mahmoud faced growing pressure from within the organization itself. Commanders questioned his past decisions and demanded explanations as to how such a massive infiltration had gone unnoticed. Some suggested he himself might be compromised, an accusation that, while unfounded, demonstrated the complete erosion of organizational trust. The command structures he had built began to fragment as different factions sought to take control of remaining resources. The operational unity that had characterized Islamic Jihad under his financial leadership gave way to internal competition and disputes for authority. Mahmoud watched helplessly as the organization he had faithfully served began to implode under the weight of recriminations and mutual suspicion. The Israeli operation had achieved its supreme strategic goal, destroying the enemy without firing a single shot, using Palestinian organizational efficiency itself as a weapon against them. The methodology developed by Mossad for Operation Golden Mercury represented a significant evolution in asymmetric warfare techniques. Traditionally, counter-terrorism relied on direct tactics, physical eliminations, preemptive bombings, and capture operations. These approaches, while often effective in the short term, generally produced unintended consequences. Assassinations created martyrs who inspired new recruits. Bombings generated international sympathy for the target groups. Capture operations resulted in legal proceedings that exposed intelligence methods. Financial warfare, on the other hand, offered unique strategic advantages. It was invisible to public opinion, generated no sympathy for the targets, and produced lasting operational damage without creating new symbols of resistance. Most importantly, it exploited a fundamental vulnerability of all militant groups, their absolute dependence on external funding to sustain continued operations. By controlling financial flows, Mossad had discovered how to control the very existence of its enemies. The agents responsible for executing the operation were experts in economic warfare, a relatively new discipline within the international intelligence community. They possessed backgrounds in international finance, banking law, and behavioral psychology. Their cover identities were built over years with verifiable professional histories and authentic social networks. When they approached targets like Mahmoud, they were not spies playing roles, but genuine professionals offering real services. The difference was that their true employers remained hidden. This authenticity was crucial to the operation's success. Mahmoud had survived decades in an environment of extreme paranoia by developing keen instincts for detecting deception. Traditional espionage approaches would have been identified immediately, but when confronted with genuine businessmen offering legitimate solutions to real problems, his own professional competence led him to make decisions that seemed logical and safe. The Israeli agents didn't need to deceive him about the quality of their services. They just needed to omit who they really worked for. The discovery of the infiltration forced Islamic Jihad to completely rethink its financial infrastructure. Mahmoud, despite his personal humiliation, was kept in his position because no one else possessed enough knowledge to rebuild the compromised systems. His first measure was to compartmentalize all financial operations, creating isolated cells that had no knowledge of one another. This approach reduced efficiency but increased security. He also implemented multiple verification systems requiring independent confirmation of all transfers above certain amounts. New intermediaries were recruited through completely different channels, avoiding any connection with the compromised networks. Banks were switched, accounts were closed, and the entire structure that had taken decades to build was abandoned. The rebuilding process would be long and costly, but Mahmoud knew it was the only way to restore operational security. The irony was that by forcing these changes, the Israeli operation had made Islamic Jihad more resilient in the long run, even having caused devastating damage in the short term. The repercussions of Operation Golden Mercury echoed far beyond Palestinian circles. Other militant groups in the region, observing what had happened to Mahmoud, initiated emergency audits of their own financial networks. Hezbollah reviewed all its funding channels. Hamas implemented additional security protocols. Smaller groups simply abandoned formal banking systems, returning to more primitive but potentially safer methods of resource transfer. The international intelligence community also took note. Agencies from various countries began studying the techniques used by Mossad, adapting them for their own operational needs. Financial warfare had demonstrated its potential as a foreign policy tool, offering strategic capabilities without the political costs associated with direct military action. International security conferences began to include sessions on the economics of counter-terrorism, recognizing that the future of asymmetric conflict would be fought as much on spreadsheets as on battlefields. The operation had established a new paradigm for modern conflict, where algorithms and auditors could be more powerful than soldiers and missiles. The psychological impact of the operation on Mahmoud was profound and lasting. For decades, he had built his professional identity on absolute competence and meticulous control of details. Discovering that he had been systematically deceived for 18 consecutive months destroyed his confidence in his own judgment. He began to question decisions he had made years earlier, looking for signs of infiltration he might have missed. Encounters he had considered casual now seemed suspicious. People he had trusted became targets of distrust. The paranoia that had always been a professional tool became a debilitating personal condition. Associates noticed changes in his behavior. He became even more reclusive, reluctant to make important decisions without extensive consultation. Meetings that once lasted minutes now stretched for hours, as he obsessively reviewed every detail. His efficiency, which had been his trademark, diminished significantly as he prioritized verification over speed. The man who had proudly built a reputation for precision and reliability now struggled with constant doubts about his own competence. The reconstitution of Islamic Jihad's financial networks required significant compromises. The new infrastructure was more secure, but also slower and more expensive. Transactions that previously took days now required weeks. Transfer fees increased substantially due to the multiple intermediaries needed to maintain security. Operational efficiency declined as field commanders faced constant delays in obtaining resources. Some planned operations were cancelled simply because funding could not be organized within the necessary timeframes. The organization that had prided itself on its ability to respond quickly to tactical opportunities now operated with the speed of a cautious bureaucracy. Mahmoud observed these changes with a mixture of necessity and frustration. He knew the additional precautions were essential to prevent future infiltrations, but he also understood that every additional layer of security reduced the operational capacity that had taken decades to develop. Financial warfare had achieved something conventional conflicts rarely achieved, forcing the enemy to become less effective as part of their own defense. 3 years after the discovery of Operation Golden Mercury, its effects still reverberated through the structure of Islamic Jihad. The organization had survived but remained significantly weakened. Its ability to conduct complex operations had diminished. Its geographic reach had contracted. Its regional influence had declined as other groups took advantage of its temporary vulnerability to expand their own operations. Mahmoud remained in his position, but his authority had been permanently compromised. Decisions he previously made autonomously now required committee approval. His word, which once had been enough to authorize transfers of millions, was now questioned and verified. He had become a cautious administrator rather than a bold strategist. The Israeli operation had achieved something more valuable than the physical elimination of an enemy. It had transformed one of Israel's most competent adversaries into a diminished version of himself. Mahmoud remained alive and active, but his effectiveness had been permanently reduced. For Mossad, this represented a more complete victory than any assassination could have provided. The broader lesson of Operation Golden Mercury lay in its demonstration of how modern conflicts are evolving beyond traditional forms of violence. In an increasingly connected and financially integrated world, the ability to manipulate economic flows offers strategic advantages that surpass conventional methods of power projection. The operation proved it was possible to paralyze entire organizations without shedding a drop of blood, without generating international headlines, and without provoking cycles of retaliation that characterize more direct approaches. It established a precedent for future intelligence operations, demonstrating that true modern warfare would be waged in financial markets as much as on physical battlefields. For Mahmoud, the operation represented not only a personal defeat, but the end of an era where technical competence and extreme caution were sufficient to protect clandestine organizations. The world had changed, and those who failed to adapt to the new realities of financial warfare would discover, as he had discovered, that even the most careful could be outmaneuvered by adversaries who understood the inherent vulnerabilities of the modern globalized economy.